Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope you are all doing very well today. So I just wanted to give you a quick update as to what has been going on with me cinema-wise over the past few days or so. Today, in fact, was a very significant day for me in that I was able, at long last, to see the film The Irishman, which is the new film directed by Martin Scorsese and starring, among other great actors, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Joe Pesci, Harvey Keitel, and others. It's a great film, a magnificent work, and so if you have the opportunity to see it, please check it out. And for those of you who have seen it already, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I don't plan on doing any kind of detailed review of it right now because I've just seen it once, and to be perfectly honest, it's still settling in my mind. I haven't quite figured out exactly my concrete thoughts on it, if that makes any sense. I wouldn't be able to make any good or substantive comments on it right now, I admit. But if I were to make some general comments that would not spoil the film for anyone who hasn't seen it, it would be this. Let me just take a step back and just give you a little bit of an explanation. So the film, as far as I understood it, had been playing, or it had played for one day in the beginning of November, the beginning of this month. And it was playing for one day as the closing night of the Tokyo International Film Festival. And it was, as I say, it was the closing night for that festival, which ended at the first Tuesday of November or something like that. Now, I had anticipated very highly being able, I wanted to watch this, and so I had tried to get tickets to that showing at the Tokyo International Film Festival to no avail. It was impossible for me to get tickets. They sold out almost immediately, and so I wasn't able to get tickets. So I had resigned myself to having to get Netflix. Now, I should let you know that I don't have Netflix, or I didn't have Netflix until about a few hours ago, actually. And so I had decided, okay, in order for me to be able to see The Irishman as soon as possible, I would have to get a Netflix subscription. And so that's what I did. I just signed up for a Netflix subscription, and I'm now a Netflix member. Now I'm on a sort of 30-day free trial period, and so I'm not sure how long. I'm not sure if I'll continue it or not. I admit I'm not the best person when it comes to streaming or watching films on streaming. I do value those services as a general proposition, but for me personally, it's still something to get used to, so I'm not quite sure if I'll continue it. But I had gotten the Netflix subscription in anticipation for being able to watch the film The Irishman, and so excuse me. And so there's that. But upon doing so, I had discovered, much to my great delight and surprise, that in fact the film The Irishman was actually playing in a very small number of select theaters here in Tokyo. Very small theaters, in fact. So I was able to attend one of the screenings today in one of the small theaters here in Tokyo. It was a very small theater in Shibuya, and the film itself wasn't on 35 millimeter or anything. It was a digital copy, what do you call it, DCP, and so it was projected on a medium-sized screen in this smallish theater. It was an art house theater in Tokyo. And so it was projected on the screen, and it was very good quality, and it was very nice. The sound was not bad. The sound quality was not bad, but it was an opportunity, at the very least, to be able to see the film in a darkened theater room with other spectators in the room. It was it was a small theater, but I think it was full, or close to maximum capacity full. So I was very impressed, and so there we were, and I sat there, and I watched the film for 3.5 hours, I think. I walked out of the theater feeling quite exhausted. I think that is a good feeling to have, because the film took me as a viewer in so many places, in so many areas, in so many arenas of thought and feeling and emotion, that I was really, by the end of it, I was so just, I don't know if ecstatic is the right word, but I was feeling very, I felt like I was given a full course meal, if you understand what I'm trying to say. It felt very filling, and I was so happy about that. And so I felt, at the end of it, I felt joyously exhausted, if you know what I mean. And that's because of the subject matter of the film and the way it presents itself. I must say that it's not again, I'm not going to go into any specific spoiler details. So I would suggest, for any of you who is interested in the works of Martin Scorsese, you have to watch this film. For anyone who is interested in the works of Robert De Niro, you have to watch this film. If you're interested in the works of Al Pacino, you have to watch this film. If you're interested in seeing another great performance by Joe Pesci, you have to watch this film. If you're interested in the compelling work of contemporary cinematic art, you have to watch this film. This is a marvelous achievement. Now, as I say, I have Netflix now for a 30-day free trial, and so I have downloaded the film The Irishman through my Netflix subscription. They have a little download feature so you can watch it offline. And so I'm now just watching, or not, I'm just rewatching certain segments and excerpts from it on my phone, which is, I admit, a very terrible way of watching a film of this scope. I was very fortunate and very lucky to have been able to see it projected on a screen, I admit, but still it was in a darkened theater, and it was bigger than my phone, and so I was fortunate in that respect. But I'm now only able to watch it on, if I have to try to hook it up, the Netflix subscription, I have to hook it up to some bigger screens here, maybe my television or a bigger tablet, but just for now, it's to have the ability to revisit certain parts of the film, to refresh my memory as to what the film was, certain memorable pieces of dialogue between characters, memorable scenes, etc. To be able to do that now is really a wonderful tool, and a great, reliable reference tool for me. And so I'm quite impressed with it. Now, as for the contents itself, I don't want to go into too many details because I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but I do feel like this is it reminds me a lot of the film. It reminds me a lot of a number of films, really. The films of Scorsese that come to mind, or that came to mind almost immediately, were the film, the film Silence. There's the film Silence. There's also the film Last Temptation of Christ in terms of the narrative structure and a sort of arc of redemption and a pathway towards absolution that is set forth in the sort of the fundamental aspect of the narrative structure in a very fascinating way. There's also kind of stylistic links I noticed, at least I think, to films such as Raging Bull and Taxi Driver. There is a particular moment, I don't want to get into it, but now, maybe in a later video perhaps, but there is a particular moment that reminded me so much of a very specific part of Taxi Driver, very memorable moments in both films, and so I was so amazed. It felt, therefore, on the one hand, in certain moments anyway, to be a work that was being made by a young filmmaker, but at the same time, and I think more overwhelmingly, this does feel like a film that is almost like a testament type of film. I don't know if eulogy is the right word necessarily with respect vis-a-vis to the gangster genre film or the crime film, the mafia film, that sort of thing. But it does feel somewhat, I don't know if I would go so far to say it's dour or lugubrious, but it feels very weighted down by some feelings of age and time and the impending notion of death, which comes to all. So it feels, therefore, to be a work of an older filmmaker. And therefore, I think it has a lot of new and interesting and different things to say than, say, films that came earlier in Martin Scorsese's career. I think the tempting comparison, and understandably so, would be to films like Casino or Goodfellas, Mean Streets even. But as I mentioned before, I think the more compatible comparisons, at least for me anyway, seem to be Taxi Driver and also more fundamentally The Last Temptation of Christ. Very much so. I was so struck at how much of a heart this film had, and it feels so close to that earlier Scorsese work. It also feels very different from the earlier gangster films of Scorsese. Now, I mentioned Mean Streets and to a certain degree Raging Bull, but also to a much more significant degree Goodfellas and Casino. There's also The Departed, but I want to focus on Mean Streets and Goodfellas and Casino for a second, because those films and this film, The Irishman, on the one hand, they have a certain bond of connectivity, if you will. I think most strikingly, most directly, being the appearance of certain characters that appear, or certain actors, that appear in most or all of the films. Harvey Keitel, of course, Robert De Niro, of course, and then later we have Joe Pesci. So there's that direct connection. But I should say that, again, upon one viewing of the film Irishman alone, I admit I haven't seen it enough times to be able to make a full, meaty comment on it, but I would say that it does feel very different from those earlier films. It feels like it has a different kind of almost cinematic philosophy or viewpoint, or it's at a different stage of life, such that its concerns feel much different than those earlier films. Now, does that make it better or worse than those films, or is this better than that film, or that better than... Again, I don't know, and I can't comment on those sorts of comparative analyses at this time. But I do think that because of where it comes in Martin Scorsese's filmography and his professional life, his personal life, compared to those other films, I do think this film, The Irishman, has so much to say that is refreshing and also very heavy, which is wonderful. It's a wonderful statement on many levels. I do think that it reminds me a lot also of certain... I was reminded also of certain, criticisms perhaps that were made contemporaneously vis-a-vis Goodfellas and vis-a-vis Casino at the time. You know, I don't know if you recall, but for those of you who remember Pauline Kael's very famous or infamous review of Goodfellas back in the day, I think it was for the New Yorker, where she was very critical of the film Goodfellas. She said she didn't like it. And she wrote, I thought her writing was very well written, but she made a point about that in the review, about the main character of that film, Goodfellas, the Henry Hill character, the Ray Liotta character, and how there were moments in that film where the Henry Hill character seemed to be on the cusp of reaching some kind of enlightened awakening, but they, according to Kael's analysis, they never led anywhere in terms of a moral awakening. The character Henry Hill seems to be shocked and horrified at the certain moments of violence in the film, and Pauline Kael points to those moments as being possible indications of some kind of awakening, but they never lead anywhere, and so they end up being, I think her word was, perfunctory. So there was a criticism, Kael's criticism, or one of her criticisms was that there didn't necessarily, at least from her point of view, there didn't necessarily seem to be any kind of moralistic follow-through with respect to the main character of that film. The criticism also with respect to Casino, not Pauline Kael's criticism, but I think just a general criticism overall of that film, was that Casino was, it was 1995, and I remember a lot of people saying at the time, oh, it was a good film, but it felt like Goodfellas light. That was a phrase that was used a lot, or still is used. It felt like a copy of Goodfellas. In particular, the Joe Pesci character in Casino, who is Nicky Santoro, I think his name was. And the Nicky character seemed to be very similar, at least some people claimed that the Nicky character seemed to be too like the Tommy character in Goodfellas. Personally, I don't think that's the case. I think that Tommy in Goodfellas is a much different character than Nicky in Casino. I think they're very different, actually. But that's a topic for another day. But my point is that there was a strain, or there was a category of criticism at the time, and perhaps even now, vis-a-vis Casino, with respect to the fact that it felt a little bit derivative. An example of that feeling of being derivative of Goodfellas was the Joe Pesci performance as Nicky in Casino. Okay, so we have these two criticisms leveled against these two films respectively. This is based off of my own memory, my own recall, which could be incorrect, but hopefully it's not. But if I'm incorrect, please let me know. But if we think about those criticisms leveled against those two films, we come to the film The Irishman now, and I could very confidently say that The Irishman seems almost, in a way, to answer those criticisms directly. With respect to this idea of being derivative, The Irishman is far from being a quote-unquote derivative work of Casino or Goodfellas. On the contrary, it is its own entity, quite clearly and distinctly, and there's no doubting that whatsoever. And the example of Joe Pesci is a great one to bring up, I think, because his performance here in The Irishman is so different than his performance in Casino and his performance in Goodfellas. Yet it has a certain depth and warmth and emotion and complexity and coldness and iciness that is a really fascinating mix. In many ways, it reminds me so much of his performance actually in Raging Bull. In many ways, I know that there are distinctions to be made, but there is a connection, and maybe an emotional connection, perhaps. Perhaps it's also due to the fact that there is a real closeness between his character here in The Irishman, his character being Russell Bufalino, and there's a closeness between his Russell and Robert De Niro's Frank that is, I think, very similar to the closeness that was felt for a significant part of the film Raging Bull between the brothers in that film, also played by Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci. So it's I also admit that the dynamic is actually a little bit different, or a lot different. The brother relationship in Raging Bull is much different in terms of the dynamic from the relationship between Frank and Russell in The Irishman. I admit that, I grant you that, but I'm talking about the relationships in terms of emotional connection. In those terms, or through those glasses, I think there is a connection to be had. So it almost feels, in a way, like Joe Pesci is coming full circle. If you think about his films with Scorsese, Raging Bull, and then Goodfellas and Casino, and then now with The Irishman. And so that is a nice little counterpoint, if you will, to the criticisms that were lodged against Casino at the time of the release of that film in '95. And then as for the criticism by Cale with respect to the film Goodfellas, I think, on the contrary, now we have the film The Irishman, which, if anything, and again, I don't want to get into too much detail, I want you to discover the film for yourself, but there is a weightiness to this film. Dare I call it a moral compass of a weightiness? Perhaps. It does feel like it is a film of moral consequence, let me put it that way. And so if Cale's criticism of the film Goodfellas vis-a-vis the Henry Hill character and any moments of awakening that ended up becoming perfunctory, in her words, if she felt that way about this film, or if anyone felt that way about this film, I don't think those criticisms would apply to the film of The Irishman, because there is nothing perfunctory about the journey that some of these characters go through. It is very impactful, and it shows the effects of time and age, and also of the effect of choices that human beings make, whether they be good choices or bad choices. So that's hopefully a very vague way of me trying to sort out in my own mind how I think it's connecting with other works by Martin Scorsese, but also it's standing on its own 2 feet as its own unique, living, breathing entity in the context of Martin Scorsese's filmography. That is the film The Irishman. So it's a really interesting conversation that I think one can have as to how this fits into Scorsese's filmography, and hopefully those conversations will continue as this film sees a lot of life going forward, and hopefully many people will see it as possible, so then those conversations will continue to be had. I also want to say that the film also reminded me so much of the Sergio Leone work Once Upon a Time in America. Now, that film, the Sergio Leone film, is also a film. It's from the early 80s, and it's a gangster film It's a mobster film in a way, but I think more fundamentally than that, it's a human story about the effects of time and about characters and growing up, making decisions, regrets, loss, confusion about the past and things like that. And I think in those terms, there are certain similarities that can be had between that film and this film, The Irishman. There are also characters that traverse time, temporally, and that is shown through the use of makeup appliances. Actors are made up to look older than they are in real life. Here in The Irishman, there is a certain digital effect or effects that are being applied to make actors that are of a certain age at the time of filming look younger than they are. So when I, as a viewer, am watching Once Upon a Time in America, I see that film and I know that at first glance I know I'm watching De Niro in old age makeup or something like that, and I know that it's makeup. I know it's not his real skin texture or anything like that. And then I see him as a young man, which is consistent with his age at the time of making that film, again in the early 80s. But I know maybe somewhere in the back of my mind that I'm watching De Niro in old age makeup, but he is acting as an older man. He is carrying his body and stuff as an older man, and he has a certain look like this to give the illusion of this. The same, I think, is true for the digital applications here in The Irishman. There's no doubt in my mind that these characters, as they are quote-unquote de-aged, I know in the back of my mind that they are not this actual age at the time of the filming of this film. I know this. But there's a similar process in my mind, I think, that's going on, just like what's going on with Once Upon a Time in America. Namely, I get caught up in the illusion of it, and it becomes like other pieces of makeup. If it's good enough, then you get used to it. And I think that's true. I mean, some of the greatest makeups are just like that. I mean, think even indeed of the film The Godfather. Marlon Brando in a very famous makeup appliance in that film to make him look somewhat older than he was at the time of filming that. But people believe it because of his performance and the way his mannerisms and the like. And I think that same kind of test is applicable when one watches De Niro and Al Pacino and Joe Pesci as younger people, or when the de-aging process is being applied to them. In particular, I think Robert De Niro, because he's in the most scenes and there is the most drastic age effect with respect to his character, I think. So that's the test that will be had for everyone who watches this film when they see this. Is it believable enough through not only the quality of the makeup, but also in the mannerisms and the performance and the way in which De Niro and others carry themselves respectively? For me, it worked brilliantly, and I got lost in that, just as I get lost in Brando's performance in The Godfather, and just as I get lost in the performances of the actors in Once Upon a Time in America and others. So I thought it worked very well. That I thought it worked actually extremely well, and I was very, very pleased with it. And the oh gosh, I don't want to get into too many details lest I spoil it, but I want to urge anyone who hasn't seen the film yet to try to see it as soon as possible. It really is something else indeed. And there are, again, I don't want to get into details, but I do think that there are certain aspects that are not perfect. I don't think any film is a perfect film. There are certain parts that I think don't necessarily work for me as well as other parts. And that's in the ways in which certain characters are either overshadowed by other events in the film or not given enough time to breathe, I think. There are certain other aspects that I think are not necessarily given enough time to breathe, but those are for the sake of other parts of the film that are given room to breathe, and I think the overall effect is a very positive one. But I do acknowledge that there are some parts that I think have a little bit of a slightly how should I put it, undercooked quality. But again, those are very minor points. Hopefully, maybe if I can get the opportunity to talk in detail, I'll hopefully have the opportunity maybe in a separate video, who knows. But that is just a general and rather incoherent, perhaps, initial reaction that I had to the film The Irishman. And so I apologize for my incoherent manner. I hope you can forgive me. But it's just, once again, I admit that everything is still kind of processing in my head. And so I can't quite get a grasp as to how specifically this has affected me. But I can say as a broad proposition that it has affected me quite positively, and it is giving me much to think about, a lot to think about, in fact, about the nature of choice and the effects of choice, and the ideas of time and age and lies and deceit, and so much more. Let me end with one more thing, which is I loved how this film took its time with what it was trying to do, what it was trying to convey to us, the information that it was trying to transmit to us, the viewers, and also the room that it gave to the characters, the main characters, to live and breathe in the world. I love that. It was very calm in terms of its pacing, and it took its time. It showed us details down to the very minute that Frank was thinking about or other characters were thinking about. It showed us the little things that ended up mattering so much, or in fact maybe not even mattering at all, who knows. But I just loved how it took its time, and it wasn't too fast or too quick. It really was very methodical and calm, and it was a nice feeling, because there was a lot of calm, yes, but you know that underneath all the conversations that are being had, there is a real either tension or a warmth of emotion, or a kind of sense of confusion or something. In other words, the map of the human heart is really being exercised to the full whenever we have even these seemingly calmly presented scenes of dialogue between two characters that are shown quite vividly and with much love and affection throughout this film. That's not to say that it's not a violent film. It is a violent film, and there are flashes and flourishes of bravura, camera technique, and the like. Don't get me wrong, it does happen, and the editing can be very quick-paced in certain segments. But in other segments, in very significant parts of the film, in fact, the film is very calm and methodical, and it lingers on certain conversations of pieces of dialogue that occur. It's interesting. It almost reminds me in that way of, I don't know, the film Pulp Fiction. How that film, it's a very over-the-top film in many respects, of course, but at the same time, there are the quiet moments in that film where the camera just waits on characters as they are talking and finishing their conversations about this or that. The same kind of approach, or a similar kind of approach, I would say, exists here in the film The Irishman, in a very, as I say, heavy-weighted way that makes the film undeniably very powerful indeed. So that is my general vague reaction to having seen the film The Irishman earlier today. That is now a film that I would strongly urge people to check out if you like this sort of film. Again, it is violent, it is a bit intense with its content, so if that's not your cup of tea, then you don't have to see it. But if you are okay with this kind of style, and if you are into the earlier works of Scorsese that I alluded to earlier, then this is obviously a film that you should watch. I would recommend that you watch it as soon as you can. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. So thank you very much. And if you've seen the film The Irishman, what did you think? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Were you excited for it? Were you kind of lukewarm about it? How did you feel? Please let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear what it is you have to say. So until we meet again, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies, and take good care of yourselves, my friends. So until we meet again, cheers and be well.